Hello, it's Adam from the Tudor Chest. In addition to running the Tudor Chest, I'm also the co-director of Simply Tudor Tours, a historic tour company that I run alongside my colleague Sarah Morris, who is known to many of you as the Tudor Travel Guide. Our May 2026 tour, Mary Queen of Scots From Crown to Captivity, is now open for bookings. This incredible week-long experience takes in many of the most iconic historical sites associated with Mary in her native Scotland, including Stirling Castle, Edinburgh Castle, the Palace of Holyrood House, and many more. Featuring Dr. Anna Turnham as our historian in residence, and featuring talks from noted historians, including Dr. Linda Porter, this tour will also feature some fun, thoroughly Scottish experiences, including a very nice whisky tasting evening. To discover more on this and secure your place on this or any of our other live tours, or to sign up to latest updates, just head to simplytudortours.com. Henry VIII is famous as the man who had 6 wives, but he also had 2 sisters, and these sisters seldom get the attention that they deserve. The younger was Princess Mary, the youngest child of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York to reach adulthood. Mary was famed for her beauty, but also the scandal caused by her second marriage to Charles Brandon, a marriage from which Lady Jane Grey traced her direct descent. To discuss Mary and her story with me today, I am pleased to welcome Amy McElroy onto the podcast for the first time. We discuss Mary's early life, her short-lived marriage to the French king, whether there is any truth in the theory that Mary introduced the French hood into England, plus much more. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest Podcast, episode 91, Mary Tudor, Queen of France, with Amy McElroy. Welcome to the Tudor Chess Podcast, Amy McElroy. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, Adam. Thank you for having me.
Very welcome. We're here today to talk about Mary Tudor, Queen of France, the other Mary that was kicking around at the time, obviously. There was Queen Mary I, but we also had her aunt, Henry VIII's younger sister, Princess Mary. You're here to talk about her because you've written a book about Mary that came out earlier this year, Mary Tudor, Queen of France. Before we get into that discussion, though, just a few questions to get to know you a bit better, if that's all right. So could you provide me with a short introduction into your background? So where you grew up and what you do full time?
Yeah, sure. So I was born in Liverpool, grew up there. I left when I was 18 to go to uni. I studied criminal justice, and then did postgraduate law. Somehow ended up completely departing from that and going into bar management. Not quite sure how that happened, but eventually I ended up trying to decide, did I want to be a lawyer? And then I thought, no, it's not for me. So, but I was still kind of interested in that kind of line. So I ended up joining the civil service, and that's where I've been ever since. So 16 years now.
You don't have any hint of a Scouse accent.
I know, it tends to come out if I'm drunk, though. So
I can hear a Midlands twang,
yeah.
but I definitely can't pick up any Liverpudlian. So what sparked your passion for Tudor history then? Was it something when you were young?
Yes and no. So I think when I was young, my mum was kind of like the intellectual parent. So she taught me to write and things, and we used to always talk about books. And we didn't live far from Speke Hall, so I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's absolutely beautiful. And I remember as a kid, like me and my brother had somehow walk home from school, and sometimes we'd get a little bit lost, and we'd be going to my granddad's and end up at Speak Hall. And it was kind of just like that building that I think was always at the back of my mind that I was interested in that. And then as I got older, I just read more and more. And I didn't do it through uni because originally when I was at school, we had a choice. I'm going to show my age now. We had to pick between geography and history.
Hmm.
And I wasn't a fan of the history teacher, shall we say. So I actually chose to go with geography, which is probably my biggest regret, but here we
Yeah.
are. And then, yeah, it just expanded from there. I read a lot. I would, and then I started reviewing books myself, and then I ended up here.
So, a couple more sort of light-hearted questions. If you could jump in a time travel machine and witness a single moment from history, what would it be?
This is going to sound really odd and really morbid, but it'd actually be the death of Erasmus. Sounds
Okay.
quite boring, but I think I've recently submitted a book on him and I just find him so fascinating. And I think
Hmm.
to witness the death of one of the world's most renowned scholars, I think would just be a very
Yeah.
poignant moment. So I think I'd say that.
I seem to recall reading somewhere that there's a chance that Erasmus was homosexual. Is that correct? Did you find anything?
There is rumours based on the wording that he uses in a lot of his
Mm,
letters. He does use the word love and like long to see you and things like that. But personally, I think it was just writing exercises
yeah.
and how they interacted with each other back then. I haven't seen anything that literally marks that he
Hmm.
was or he wasn't.
Yeah.
So he does make a joke at some point about a drawing that Hans Holbein had done of him. And he said, "Oh, if I actually looked like that, I'd have a wife." So
Okay.
I don't know. I think you could argue either way,
Mm,
but I would probably personally say it's probably just the way they wrote to each other between
yeah.
friends.
So, given the subject today, if you could ask Mary Tudor one question, what would it be?
I think I would probably ask what would her opinion be of Brandon marrying Catherine Willoughby after her death?
Yes, because it came very quickly. It was like 2 months or so.
Yes, very
Yeah.
quickly. So I think I'd be intrigued to know what her opinion is of that.
Well, as I said, we are here to talk about Mary Tudor. You've written a book, as I said at the start, Mary Tudor, Queen of France. So, why her story? What sparked your interest in Princess Mary's story?
Well, my first book was around educating the Tudors, so looking at the education of the Tudor princes and princesses, what did they study, who taught them, things like that. And obviously, a lot when you look at the Tudors revolves around Henry. And I just became interested in Mary because she seemed to always be in his shadow. Like everything that I read was around Mary and oh, something happened with Henry. Mary happened to be in his shadow. And I just thought, well, surely there's more to her than that. Like obviously I knew
Yeah.
that she'd gone to France and then she'd married Brandon. I knew all of that, but I thought there's got to be more to this Tudor princess that. So yeah, I started digging and went down a few rabbit holes and there we go.
So she was the fifth born child of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, but
Yeah.
the youngest to reach adulthood. What were her earliest days like? Where were they spent, and so on?
She spent most of her childhood in the royal nursery, so she was brought up around Margaret and Henry for a period, Edmund as well. Obviously, as you've said, she was the youngest to reach adulthood, so and Henry would have been obviously as the male, the one that was the dominant person in that household.
Mm,
Um, she did have interactions with her mom, and but otherwise she largely spent most of her time with Margaret and Henry, so they had their own nurses and things like that. Um, and the royal nursery would move about when, obviously, as the royal palaces did need cleaning and things like that, but it was largely based at Eltham, so that's where they would have spent most of their time.
I see. Okay. And when she was very young, did she have her own household? Or in those first few years, was it just very much with her siblings and her mother on occasion?
Yeah, so you're right. She wouldn't have had a household originally. She would have, of course, had nurses, rockers, people, wet nurses, that kind of thing. But she ultimately didn't formalize her own household for a few years. It was more the general staffing of the Royal Nursery that would have looked after all of the children at that point. But obviously, Margaret and Henry were older than her, so they would have had their own households before she did.
Yeah. When they were together, is there evidence that the siblings were quite close? So there's often discussion that Mary was particularly close to Henry.
You don't see it so much in her very early years, but as they grow up, you do see evidence of like Henry and Mary being together or sharing, I suppose the only word is resources, for instance, like tutors, that kind of thing. Not necessarily in the same classroom, but they seemed because they were closer in age, things were basically more along the same lines than Margaret, who was older than both of them. So I think
Hmm.
it was largely the age gap that led to them two being as close as they were. But as they did get older, they did practice dancing together and music and things like that. So I think do believe they grew up quite closely.
And I suppose because at this point as well, Henry is not the heir apparent, then that there isn't the pressure that will have been evident with Prince Arthur. And to that end, is it fair to say that Mary wouldn't have known her eldest brother, Prince Arthur, particularly well?
I think that is fair to say. So Arthur was obviously away in the Welsh Marches. She did, of course, meet him, and she knew who he was. Like she was at his wedding to Catherine of Aragon and things like that. But I don't think you could claim that they had any kind of close relationship. That's not to say she wouldn't have grieved when he died, but I
Mhm.
think in comparison to her relationship with Henry, definitely not close at all.
Yeah, because there's also a 10-year age gap, I think, between the
It's
two.
quite a big age gap between Arthur and Mary, yeah.
Yeah, that's quite a big gap, and he's obviously, as you said, he's in the Welsh Marches, albeit not very for not a very long time. But it does seem logical that yeah, he would have been much more sort of aware of her than the other way around because she was that much younger.
Yeah. I don't think she would have been spending time writing letters to him and stuff. So
Yeah. So Mary does eventually get her own household at the age of 6, I believe. So where was she located? Do we know how big this household would have been?
she was still in the Royal Nursery at that point. So she was still at Eltham, but she was
Hmm.
basically given a household of ladies in waiting, a tutor, a doctor, things like that. So her household, when it was created, would have meant that the staffing at Eltham grew.
Yeah.
We don't have exact numbers, but we do know that she was provided with a doctor, ladies in waiting. When she was a bit older, she was given, I shouldn't say given, that sounds wrong for what I'm next going to say, a companion in Jane Poppincourt. So, yeah, her household did grow, and those people were responsible directly for Mary at that point, rather than all the royal children.
As a princess, I mean, she would have obviously been extremely high in terms of precedence, outranking. I suppose the only women ahead of her, from a rank perspective, were her mother and sister, I guess.
And at a point, Catherine of Aragon. So I think she obviously knew that. She knew that she was a princess and things like that. And when she reached that age where she got her own household, that's when her clothing and things would have changed to become the more formal Tudor gowns that we all know so well. So she would have been like a miniature version of the gowns that we all see and love. That's when she would have started wearing all those fancy fabrics.
At what point did marriage prospects for Mary begin to be spoken of, and with whom? I mean, I believe that at one point there was even a possible marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor. So, yeah, when was marriages first sort of set out?
Surprisingly, Mary's first offer, I suppose, so the first time we hear of her being on the marriage market, she was actually only 3 years old, which sounds extreme for today. Um, but it was more a case of her dad was approached. So Henry VII was approached by the Duke of Milan on behalf of his son. And what he was actually asking for was Henry to support him in his claim for Milan, but as part of that,
Hmm.
Mary's hand in marriage for his son. Henry was very polite in his rejection of that offer. He essentially said, I'm friends with France, so I'm not getting involved in this situation. But also, my daughter is way too young. If you want to come back in a few years, we can discuss it then, but I am not
Yeah,
discussing
I
it
mean,
while she's 3 years
yeah, very
old.
young.
Yes, extremely young, even for the Tudors, very, very young. But you are correct. She would then eventually go through, well, not her, I suppose, because she was too young, but there would then be negotiations with Charles, who would later become Holy Roman Emperor. Those negotiations went on for a very, very long time. She was eventually betrothed to Charles with the understanding that she would go over to Austria and finish her childhood there so she could learn their customs and things like that. Um, Maximilian and Ferdinand at the time kept putting things off. And at the point that Henry VII died, it still wasn't finalised. So Henry VIII then continued with those negotiations. But ultimately, as we know it, it didn't come to fruition. So,
Mm.
but yes, those negotiations with Charles went on for a very, very long time.
Much is commented on Mary's apparent beauty. It's something we hear a lot about, that she was regularly described as being the most beautiful, one of the most beautiful princesses in Europe, certainly more attractive than her older sister. What do the contemporary sources say about her appearance?
The contemporary sources do say that she was beautiful, so I think we need to bear in mind when we're looking at the contemporary sources that a lot of them are from ambassadors. I can't see an ambassador
Hmm.
writing this princess is really ugly. So I think we do have to sometimes accept that it may be exaggerated, but they do all seem to agree. Like there is one that says her eyebrows are too light or something like that. But I think most of them do refer to she is very beautiful. So they say that she's quite slight. They talk about um, her not being too tall, not being too short. Her virtue is mentioned quite a lot. Then there's the reference that we all know where she's called a nymph from heaven. So I think we can probably accept that she was quite beautiful, but whether she was the most beautiful woman in Europe at the time, I don't know. I think we just have to know that there probably were exaggerated sources as well.
Yeah, because it's a funny one, isn't it? But I mean, I believe that she was a redhead, like her brother Henry, that sort of classic Tudor red hair. But then the most famous portrait of her, the wedding portrait with Brandon years later, she's
Yeah.
clearly brunette and actually not particularly well. You wouldn't look at that portrait and go, "Oh my God, she's a ravishing beauty." She's not unattractive, but yeah, I mean, she actually looks quite a lot like Anne Boleyn in some respects in that portrait.
And I think it's interesting because we know that the Tudors kind of associated beauty with pale skin, blonde hair, but then they're reporting Mary as the most beautiful person. But then in that portrait, she's got dark hair. And
Yeah.
obviously, we know it's not a contemporary portrait, but it's like, well, surely you'd get her hair color right. So, yeah,
I do know there were a couple of we've been robbed of decent portraits of Mary because I don't know whether you have recently picked up or read the book from Sylvia Barbara Soberton about secrets of the Tudor portraits. She was on the podcast a few weeks ago, and she's discovered that there are at least two or three contemporary portraits of Mary from life that are now completely lost, but there's descriptions of them if they're still around somewhere in someone's loft or something. But we've kind of been robbed of decent portraits of her, even though there were some clearly at one point.
I think, that there's got to be some. You can't be a Tudor princess, marry the King of France, and there's no, well, whether they still survive or not is another matter, but
Yeah.
it is a shame because it's one of those things that we all know what Henry looks like. Do you know what I mean? We don't need any more.
Yeah.
Well, I know it'd be nice if there were more portraits discovered, but it's one of those things that it is. I wish that we did have one that was this is her.
So it was eventually decided that she would marry King Louis XII of France. She was 18, he was
Mm.
52.
Yeah.
What do we know of how Mary herself felt about this marriage, if that's at all recorded?
Her actual reaction isn't really recorded anywhere. I think Mary shows herself to be a true princess in that she knew what was expected of her. She doesn't seem to have fought it. Um, and I
Hmm.
think she knew what that would bring to England. So I think she was wise in that she saw the bigger picture. I don't think for her it was, you've got to do this just because it's going to bring your brother some money or whatever. I think she genuinely understood that it would bring peace. And I suppose you can probably guess that he's 52.
Hmm.
Chances are I'm going to outlive him. So I think she accepted it for the situation it was. Whether she
Yeah.
was truly happy about it, I would probably guess no. Although I suppose being
Hmm.
born a princess, your expectations are that you are going to marry a king or a prince or something, someone somewhere that may not necessarily be to your liking.
Is it true that upon their first meeting that she blew him a kiss, or is that just a legend?
Yes. So apparently Louis chanced upon seeing Mary, if you believe that. I don't believe it for a second that he just happened to be riding where she was, but whatever. Um, and he apparently um threw his arm around her and kissed her. And she tried to dismount from her horse, but he wouldn't let her. So she blew him a kiss. And
Right.
it they don't you can't really say that he probably knew what that meant, but apparently he was very happy with it. And then obviously went back undercover, back to his palace so Mary could have the spotlight on her as she entered Abbeville. But yes, she did blow him a kiss.
Oh, that's quite cute, though, I suppose. The marriage goes ahead and she becomes Queen of France, but she doesn't retain that status for very long. It's just 3 months. So, what is the slightly amusing story often put about around Louis's death?
So the rumor was that Louis had died as a result of overexerting himself in bed with his new wife. So poor Mary, this young 18-year-old princess, is,
Stabbed him to death, basically.
yeah, rumored to have technically killed her husband.
Do we know what the actual cause of death was, or is that lost?
Well, Louis was quite sickly, and even when she was there, he would take periods of rest. She
Hmm.
would go off and do things because he was unwell. When he was unwell, she would largely spend most of her time with him. Like she'd play a lute for him and sing to him and all sorts. So I think she did care for him, but I think it was more in a this man is sickly and old than
Yeah.
I love my husband to death kind of thing. So yeah, I don't definitely don't think the rumor's true anyway.
But Mary did stipulate, well, she made a request of her brother before leaving England
Hmm.
regarding future marriages. So can you just walk me through that?
Originally, Henry was meant to sail with Mary when she left Dover, and because of the weather and everything, he ultimately decided, I'm not going to do that. Like, you can go off on your own in the middle of storms. Nice brother. Um, but she
Mhm.
apparently said to him before she got on the ship that I'm going to go through with this marriage, but if I outlive him, you need to promise me that I can choose my next husband, essentially. And apparently he agreed. So
Mhm.
whether he agreed just to shut her up and get her on the ship or not is a different matter. But she does refer to it later on
Yeah.
in letters. So I am inclined to believe that he did make that promise.
Whether he meant it, to your point, is,
Yeah,
is another story
it's
entirely.
Henry, who
I'd
knows?
be inclined to think he was just like, yeah, 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 off you go.
Get on your ship.
Yeah, I don't think he actually ever meant to keep his word there. But infamously, Mary does eventually return to England, and when she returns, she's married again, this time to Charles Brandon, who is Henry's best friend. So, based on your research, your
Yeah.
understanding, had there been long-held feelings between the two for some time, or was it sort of more Mary towards Charles and he just sort of went with it? Well, what's your sense on this?
I think there's actually a bit of both. So I think for the entertainments and the masks and stuff that they were both involved with before Mary went off to France, they were together a lot. Not alone, because that would have obviously been inappropriate, but they were
Hmm.
together in entertainments with Henry. Um, so I think there probably was a bond there. Whether it was a bond of I'd love to marry you or not, I don't think we could probably say. But I think they definitely held affection for each other. And I think when Louis died, Mary wasn't stupid. She knew that, she's going to be back on that marriage market. She's got to make a decision now of, do I take matters into my own hands, or do I trust my brother that he made that promise to me before I left? And Brandon writes that she threatened to go into Flanders and enter a convent, and she'd rather be dead than be married off. So he ultimately agreed. He basically says she gave me an ultimatum, and I couldn't stand to see her crying like that, so I agreed.
The marriage that took place, I believe, at the Hotel de Cluny in Paris, and wasn't Francis of France there? Like, wasn't he a wedding guest?
Yes, so their first ceremony was meant to be this big secret ceremony, and afterwards Francis loses his mind and screams at Brandon about how dare you marry the Dowager Queen of France and all of this kind of stuff, but he was actually there. So I think it was just a big front of I'm gonna make a scene because Henry could actually be mad at me, but realistically I was there.
Right, I see. Okay. So, how does Henry VIII react? What's the fallout from this, and so on?
Henry publicly reacts quite negatively. Um, but there's letters from Wolsey that essentially where Brandon's talking about marriage and he talks about his conversations with Francis and that Francis had said to him, "You've come here to marry Mary," and he's like, "No, I haven't." He said, "You have because she's already told me." Um, and he confesses that to Wolsey, and Wolsey writes back essentially saying, "Me and Henry are quite happy with how things are progressing." Like, so it's kind of like Henry knew what was going to happen. There is an element of
Hmm.
Henry saying to Brandon, "You broke your promise to me. You promised me before you went that you wouldn't marry her." So it's like, well, you must have known then that there's something could possibly happen, because otherwise, why would you make your best friend promise not to marry your sister unless you thought that it was
Yeah,
a big possibility? But at the
yeah,
time, there were the two factions at court. So you had the Norfolk faction and you had the Wolsey slash Brandon faction. And I think Henry's reaction was largely to appease the Norfolk faction, because obviously it was treason, that he could have cut off Brandon's head. And I think he didn't want to do that. So I think his reaction was very much, I have to react to appease Norfolk because I am the king and they have done this. But I secretly
hmm.
knew about it, so I'm not going to do anything other than find them and pretend I'm angry.
Okay, so in you actually think then in the overall, really, he was a bit like, meh, I knew it was going to happen, but I'll put on a bit of a front. I mean,
Yeah.
Mary could have been there could have been an advantageous marriage for her with another
Oh,
potential,
definitely. And I think
you know,
that's part of the bit that we have to wonder, A, did Henry mean it when he promised her? Or
mm,
was he hoping, I'll play along with, like, we don't know, maybe he said to Brandon, you can marry her, but bring her back to England first. And then would he have gone back on that and gone,
yeah,
actually, I'm going to marry you to Charles or whoever? So I think. I think he knew that there was a possibility that would happen, and because it did happen, he made the most out of it to get what he wanted, which was ultimately all their money and jewels,
So in it,
and annoyed Francis in the process by bringing her back to England.
yes. So in addition to coming home with a new husband, there is also some suggestion that Mary brought home the French hood and that the honour of introducing it to the English court should actually go to her. Now, again, does that appear to be true or is that one of those legends?
I think you could give her partial credit, but I think the French hood is one of those things like, as mentioned Jane Poppincourt earlier, she was over in England, she was French. So she would have been wearing a
Hmm.
French hood. And I don't think you can isolate it to one person. So I think obviously Mary probably would have
Yeah.
influenced people around her. And then obviously when Anne Boleyn came back from France, she probably would have influenced people around her. So I think it's probably a joint effort by the women of the court, shall we say, that would have then,
Hmm.
expanded outwards to make the French hood more popular. So I think it is a bit of both. I think you can give her some credit, but I don't think it was just her that brought it over.
Mary and Charles Brandon, as we've already said, they are eventually forgiven. They're made to pay a large fine. So to them, their marriage itself, where did they reside? I'm assuming that like other big members of the court, that they were quite itinerant. So where were they primarily based, and was the marriage successful?
When Mary initially returned, they lived well, near London or in London. So Brandon had a property that was called Suffolk Place. So that was their primary residence for many years when they weren't at the Royal Court. Now,
Hmm.
Westhorpe is always linked to Mary as that was her home, blah, blah. And yes, it was, but not for years later. Brandon spent an incredible amount of money on refurbishing Westhorpe. And it was years until it was actually ready. So I think you'd have to probably say Suffolk Place and then Westhorpe in later years. And she did visit other properties, but those were the two main ones that she would spend her time at. And she'd also spend her time
Okay.
going to visit surrounding monasteries. And when I say visit, I mean for like weeks. So she'd stay for weeks and then she'd
Mhm.
obviously pay them afterwards and gift them things. So she became a patron of the monasteries. She would go and visit friends. They did spend a lot of time together, so they would go off hunting, her and Brandon. They'd also go back to the court together. So Henry had called them both back for entertainments and things. So I think it was a successful marriage. Yeah.
Well, they also have four children. We know like, the most about the second one, Frances, because she is the mother of Lady Jane Grey. But who were their other children? And
Yeah.
what were their stories?
So her first child was actually called Henry. And it's actually quite sad. So he was born not long after she returned from France. So he was born in 1516. But he sadly died when he was 6, I believe it was.
Mhm.
Um, so obviously Brandon lost his male heir. You then did have Francis, who we have mentioned. Following Francis was Eleanor. So Eleanor was born a couple of years after Francis. She went on to marry Henry Clifford, who was the second Earl of Cumberland. So her most famous child, I would probably say, was Margaret Stanley, who was Countess of Derby. But she did also have two sons as well. So she had Henry and Charles. She actually lived till 1547. So Eleanor actually had quite a lengthy life for the Tudor period anyway.
Mhm.
And then the last one was, shockingly enough for the Tudors, also called Henry. So the second Henry Brandon was born a year after the first one died. The second Henry was actually installed as the first Earl of Lincoln. Um, but again, he unfortunately didn't make it very, very long. He
Mhm.
died in 1534, I believe it was.
Mhm.
And he was the one that was actually supposedly intended to marry Catherine Willoughby, um, who
Yes.
was a ward of Brandon and Mary at the time. But obviously that didn't happen. She married his dad instead.
Well, also that it was him, and I suppose the former Henry that lived to the age of 6. Both these boys, I assume, would have been seen as quite considerable candidates for the succession because they were both male and born in England.
Yes, I think it's a very interesting thing to think about what would have happened if either of those boys had been alive when Edward VI died.
Yes. Yeah.
So, yeah, one of those things that it's we can only wonder, can't we? But I think you're right. They were male heirs of the Tudor line. So,
Mm. And born in England, which again
yes.
makes because the whole thing about Margaret's line, Margaret Tudor's line is that they're born in Scotland,
Yeah.
but these boys are born in England. They're born to a legitimate marriage.
Yeah.
So I think actually when Edward VI died, if either of them had still been alive, and well, it's a huge what if, isn't it? I mean, the whole reason Jane Grey kind of comes into the mix really is because of John Dudley. But
Yeah.
it's interesting to consider what would have happened there and whether Mary,
Mhm.
as in later Queen Mary the First, would have had a much may have had a much more difficult time ousting a boy from the throne.
Yeah, and I think part of it would have come down to the boys' relationships with Edward and
Mm,
Anne Mary,
yeah,
because, Mary may not have had a problem if she was on good terms with her, well, it would have been her cousins, wouldn't it?
yeah,
So she may have felt that that was right herself.
yeah.
We don't know. And I suppose Edward's relationship with them as well, would he have thought, yeah, I'm going to pass it to my cousin. I suppose for Edward, what would have mattered was their religion. So
Yes.
if they'd have gone towards the Protestant leanings like he did, or if they'd have remained true Catholic for Edward, that would have been the decider.
Mm,
But ultimately, I think it would have been the rest of the court and the general public that had probably have decided if there was a dispute between one of the Brandon boys and Mary, for instance.
yeah. So we touched on French hoods a few minutes ago, and you briefly mentioned another name that is obviously closely tied to them. It's time to talk Anne Boleyn. So, as I understand it, Mary absolutely loathed Anne. She sided firmly with Catherine of Aragon. So, is that correct? And if so, how did it impact her relationship with her brother?
I don't know if I'd say loath. I think for Mary, it was the situation rather than who it was. So I think it could have been anyone,
Hmm.
not necessarily Anne. I think for Mary, when she was younger and Margaret left for Scotland, her mum died, her Margaret Beaufort died, and I think she lost that female companionship until Catherine of Aragon. And I think she filled a huge space in her life. And we know they were close. Like they used to go hunting together, they used to dance together, they used to do all sorts together. So I think for Mary, it was about that relationship with her sister-in-law rather than Anne as a person. And I think for Mary, she was obviously Catholic herself. So although we don't know her exact feelings on whether it was right um, by the church or not, we don't know. But I think it was her loyalty to Catherine that made her the way she was into like she did speak out
Hmm.
about Anne. Um, there are things that build up to that. For instance, Anne accused, well, Brandon started it, I guess. Brandon accused her of having a relationship with Thomas Wyatt. The following year, she accuses Brandon of having an unnatural relationship with his daughter. So I think you can probably see that both sides here of are not happy with one another. And Brandon was banished
Yeah.
from court for his accusations, but obviously it didn't last long because Henry and his best friend can't be apart for long. Um, but ultimately for Mary, I think that's when she spoke out then, after Brandon
Yeah.
had been accused of whatever relationship with his daughter. Now, we don't know specifically what she said. But as a result of that, the two factions, again, Norfolk, Brandon, and it resulted in Norfolk's men actually killing one of Brandon's who was in sanctuary, which is obviously a huge no-no. And Brandon was obviously not happy about that. So he's gone
Yeah.
off in a huff, trying to kill people, not literally, but Cromwell's gone after him to try and calm matters down. And that was all allegedly about Mary speaking out. So we don't know if she spoke out about Anne individually or the situation of he shouldn't be getting divorced kind of thing. So sadly, I guess, unless
Yeah.
something appears, we won't know. But my view is I don't think it was Anne personally. I think it was the situation and her loyalty to Catherine.
Okay. That man that got murdered in Sanctuary is my ancestor.
No
Yeah.
way!
So he was called Sir, as I'm sure you know, he was called Sir William Pennington, and
Mm.
he was my time 16 grandfather.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was very exciting when I discovered that because I mean, it's not the most common surname. And when we were doing the family tree, yeah, we were able to figure it out. And yeah, so it's time 16 grandfather was that man and it's actually portrayed in the
That's
Tudors.
incredible.
So someone portrayed my time 16 grandfather being killed.
So your family were literally in the midst of the warring factions of the Tudor
Yeah.
court?
Yeah, it was fun when we made that link.
Oh, wow. That is incredible.
Mary dies relatively young. She's just 37. She dies in June 1533. I believe that she was actually quite sickly for
Yeah.
quite a long time. I could be wrong, but do we know, well, what do you believe was her cause of death?
To be honest, there are records going back from when she was young about doctors attending her, like apothecaries attending her for weeks at a time. But she then goes months, even years without anything. And she writes herself sometimes that she's unwell and there's pains in her side and things like that. But we never actually get told what the doctors or anybody are treating. Now, as she did get older, there it does seem to occur more often. So there's reports of Brandon writing to Wolsey to say, I know that we're meant to leave court, but can we stay because Mary's not well? She can't move. Because obviously the court was run very precisely, wasn't it? So they needed to know when people are leaving, when people are coming in,
Mm,
who's paying for what. And so, and then there's records of her having doctors back at Westhorpe, of her writing to Henry saying, I'm not well. Um, and obviously the Tudors were very flowery with their language, but she's very much like seeing you would make everything better to Henry and things. And she recalls Brandon on occasion because she's so unwell. So sadly, I don't think we'd ever know. I think we can come up with some suggestions, like was it kidney problems
yeah.
with her having pains in her side and things like that. But ultimately, we don't know. But yeah, it does seem to be something that was recurring throughout her life.
And as I said, just she was only 37, so she actually wasn't very old when she died. I think that was the same age as her mother, wasn't it? Well, her
Um,
mother died on her 37th
yeah,
birthday. Um,
yeah.
so she's initially buried in Bury St Edmund's Abbey before being moved to St Mary's Church following the dissolution of the monasteries. Given her status she's a princess by birth, she's a queen of France by marriage, she becomes a duchess. I'm surprised that she wasn't buried in sort of greater pomp. Do we know why this didn't happen?
Well, her original funeral, there was a lot of pomp.
Yeah.
But when obviously the dissolution happened, it kind of seems like they just moved her to the nearest church. And I don't know if it's a
Okay.
respect thing that we're not going to dig somebody up and converse them miles down the road to London, or if it's a cost saving. We all know what Henry was like with money. So it could just be that Henry had said, if you move anybody, put them in the nearest church. And that happened to be St. Mary's. And it is quite underwhelming, I suppose, for
Yeah.
who she was,
Yeah. You'd expect Westminster Abbey or something like that.
but it's also very peaceful. And when you look at her actual tomb, and then read that there was originally not even a curb around it, just flat ground. It's like it is quite sad, but I think now I find it quite peaceful in that church. And the stained glass window obviously was years and years later, but that is a beautiful memorial to her. So I
Mm.
think she
Yeah.
seems to have, as she got older, longed for a peaceful life, and I like to think that where she is now is peaceful. So
Well, my final question for you then is ultimately, what do you think is her legacy? Do you think, does she have one? She's a character that kind of, we only in some respects get hints of, but what do you think her legacy is?
I think the sad bit is for anybody that you ask about Mary, one of the first things that they will think of is Lady Jane Grey. And to me, that's a really sad
Hmm.
legacy that it's not even Mary. Do you know what I mean? It's her granddaughter. And yes, it's a very sad situation, but that's not Mary. Whereas now, now I've
Yeah.
researched and written about her, I would actually say that her legacy should be our charity. Um, how kind she was to others, how often
Okay.
she was seeking assistance for others that, yeah, you would expect it from royalty because they were expected to be charitable and things, but she seemed to go the next step, like even in the months before she died, she was right into Lord Lisle to get a job for somebody. Do you know what I mean? Like saying, can you take this person on as a soldier? And so I think
Hmm.
when you look through her life, there's constant things of her trying to help others where she didn't necessarily need to. Like when her household got dismissed, she could have just accepted it. She didn't. She tried to find John Palsgrave a tutoring position in Paris and things like that. So I think, yeah, I'd definitely say it should be her charity. It's probably not, but I think it should be.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people do. They just do go straight to Jane Grey. I didn't
Yeah.
know about the level of her charity and sort of the kindness there. So that's her story, not her granddaughter's. So that feels much more appropriate. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for coming on to the podcast. For those who want to keep up to date with you, are you across social media?
I am, so I think I'm everywhere. So Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, Threads, X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it these days. I'm also on Substack, so it's just my name or Amy MC Books. One of them will come up, but yeah, I'm across them
Lovely.
all.
And you mentioned earlier that you've just submitted a new book on Erasmus. So when is that due for release?
It won't be out till early next year, so I've
Okay.
submitted the first draft, going through editing at the moment. But yeah, it's been a work of very long nights and lots of coffee. So
And have you got any other books planned?
I have. So at the moment, I'm writing one on the tutors. So I do delve into it a little bit in my first book about who were the tutors of the royal children anyway. I
Mm,
wanted to expand on that. So I found that there is this big circle of like humanist men that were in England, and they all seem very, very linked. Like one taught one, and one then the other one taught the other. And if one quit a tutoring job, the other one would take it. So it's like this nice little niche circle that I wanted to dig a bit more into. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
jolly good. Okay. Well, thank you again very much for coming on the podcast. This has been really fascinating. I've been longing to do an episode on Mary for a long time. So yeah, thank you again very much for
I
coming
know,
on.
thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. My thanks to Amy McElroy for coming onto the show to discuss Mary Tudor with me, and my thanks to you, the listener, for tuning in. Next week, I'm thrilled to be welcoming Helen Carr onto the podcast for a discussion on her latest book, Sceptred Isle, A New History of the 14th Century. That will drop next Thursday. If you have any suggestions for future podcast episodes, please do reach out to me via Instagram. I would love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and catch you next week.